Alors, bonjour tout le monde. Good afternoon. Happy to see so many of you here for what may very well be Daniel Blaikie's last scrum here in the foyer. I am very happy to be joined by my friend and colleague Daniel Blaikie, with whom I have worked on these amendments to the Canada Elections Act that were tabled in the House of Commons a few minutes ago. I was pleased to introduce in the House of Commons a set of amendments to the Canada Elections Act which will enhance Canadians' ability to exercise their right to vote while strengthening protections against foreign interference in our elections. As you will know, this bill stems from the Supply and Confidence Agreement we struck with our NDP partners. Mr. Singh and the Prime Minister, in signing this agreement, made commitments to make it easier for Canadians to vote in a federal election. And as I said, it was a privilege for me to work these last number of months with an outstanding parliamentarian, with Daniel Blaikie, and I very much look forward to continuing this work with his NDP colleagues as well. The Prime Minister and Mr. Singh committed to expand options Canadians currently have to cast their ballots, and this bill seeks, amongst other measures, to add 2 more days of advance voting, to make the Vote on Campus program permanent, and take steps towards voting at any polling station in a voter's riding. The bill also proposes to offer dedicated on-site voting for voters living in long-term care homes and enhancements as well to the increasingly popular and accessible vote by mail process. En plus de mesures visant à offrir plus de façons aux Canadiens de voter, le projet de loi déposé aujourd'hui afin de modifier la loi électorale viendrait aussi renforcer nos mesures visant à assurer l'intégrité de nos élections. Les mesures contenues dans le projet de loi s'ajouteraient à notre éventail robuste de mécanismes visant à lutter contre l'ingérence étrangère et la désinformation, 2 phénomènes en croissance dans les démocraties occidentales que notre gouvernement s'efforce à contrer depuis 2015. Le projet de loi propose donc d'interdire les déclarations fausses ou trompeuses sur les activités électorales faites dans le but de perturber une élection ou ses résultats, et de clarifier que l'utilisation abusive de l'intelligence artificielle, telle que la création d'hyper-trucages ou deepfakes, comme on dit en anglais, afin, par exemple, d'usurper l'identité d'un candidat, est une infraction au sens de la loi électorale. Canada has one of the most resilient democracies in the world, and that is no small part due to our world-class electoral system, which seeks to make it easier and intuitive to vote. Voting is a fundamental right in Canada, and our government will work with parliamentarians over the coming weeks to ensure that we uphold that right in the best way possible and reinforce the integrity of our electoral system. And as I said, it's a privilege for me now to ask my colleague Daniel Blaikie, with whom I've had the privilege of working on this particular bill, to say a few words, and then I can't imagine that we're both not all very excited to take your questions.
Well, thank you very much. I'm glad to be here for what may indeed be my final press conference here in the foyer, and to talk about, and only about, these proposed changes to the Elections Act.
That's it.
Nous sommes ici aujourd'hui pour en discuter des propos pour des changements aux lois électorales pour assurer ou augmenter la sécurité et l'accessibilité à la vote pour les Canadiens et les Canadiennes. I think there's a number of important proposals here. You know, there's a current pilot on Indigenous languages, for instance, and putting Indigenous languages on the ballot so that Indigenous people can read that ballot and interact with the electoral system in their own language. And these changes will also facilitate other pilots, like, for instance, telephone voting for people with disabilities, which is something that's done in some other jurisdictions. So we want to enable Elections Canada to be able to embark on pilots to explore those technologies, another way of doing things that is going to make it easier for Canadians to vote. We know anyone who's worked on a campaign knows that there are often Canadians who are struggling to balance the obligations of work and family in a day, as well as get to polling stations in order to be able to vote. And that's why we felt it was very important to try and expand access and have more days upon which Canadians could vote. So in that regard, this bill will not only propose a study for expanding Election Day to be a 3-day election, but after some feedback from the Chief Elections Officer, that is a study because there's some more work to do. In the meantime, we're going to be able to expand advance polling by those 2 days to ensure that we are nevertheless moving forward with giving Canadians more options and make it easier for them to be able to get to the polls before Election Day. So those are some of the things that are being proposed in this bill, along with measures to address the recent court ruling in BC around the protection and privacy of Canadians' data. As campaigning becomes more digital, becomes that much more important to protect the security of Canadians' personal information, and there are some proposals in this bill to do just that. So I'm happy to be at the launch of what will be, I'm sure, a thorough and rigorous legislative process and public engagement process as Canadians provide feedback on the proposals in this bill, and I'm happy to take some questions about the bill. Thank you.
Minister LeBlanc, do you expect that these changes will be implemented if we go to an election in 2025?
It's very much our hope. As Daniel said, there's a parliamentary process. It's important that parliamentarians obviously can participate fully. It's important also that Canadians be heard, and people like the Chief Electoral Officer, I assume, when we hope the bill gets to committee, but it certainly would be our intention. This is a commitment, as I said, that was in our supply and confidence agreement with the New Democrats. The Prime Minister and Mr. Singh agreed to these important measures, and it's our hope that we'll work not only with New Democratic colleagues, but other parliamentarians to ensure that this legislation can be in place as quickly as possible, and obviously before an election if it occurs in 2025.
Here, the voting anywhere and the 3-day election day, those were part of the agreement with the NDP. So why are they not in the bill? Why are you only taking steps to work towards them?
That's a very good question, and Daniel and I had an occasion, for example, to meet with the Chief Electoral Officer. There were subsequent meetings with officials from Elections Canada. It was certainly our hope. Mr. Singh and the Prime Minister very much wanted to have a 3-day voting period. Saturday, Sunday, and Monday would be the election period. And voting anywhere in a constituency would allow, obviously, greater access to the polls, to voting for people in a riding. The principal objective, as I said, was to improve access to ballots, improve the ability of Canadians to participate in the electoral system. Elections Canada identified some reasonable concerns around the technology, for example, with somebody voting anywhere in a particular polling station in an electoral district. There would have to be software developed and things like iPads available, for example, at these polling stations that would allow people to immediately be removed from the voters list if they exercise their right to vote in a particular polling station. The compromise solution with which we thought was important to put in place now was greater access and easier access to what are called transfer certificates, which would allow, it's a mechanism that I wasn't aware of. Elections Canada talked to Daniel and me about this. We thought it was an important first step, but we very much want Elections Canada to come back in a prescribed timeline in the legislation with a path to getting to this voting anywhere in a constituency. Obviously, our concern is always around the integrity of the electoral system. And again, with respect to a 3-day voting period, these were concerns that Elections Canada properly raised with us around the ability of being able to find suitable locations. For example, in some cases on advance polls on a weekend, they could be in religious facilities associated with a parish or a religious community. On weekends, sometimes they could be in a school, but not on Monday of Election Day. So Elections Canada came to us with some thoughtful sort of operational challenges. But again, we think that they need to be mandated by Parliament to come back with a precise timeline of how we can get to that. We thought was a very reasonable objective that the Prime Minister and Mr. Singh agreed to in the supply and confidence agreement. Daniel, do you want to add something?
Sure. Maybe on the question of transfer certificates, for instance, I think like just for Canadians to understand, like, you know, there are times when people show up to the polls in the evening on the last day of the election. They might have waited in line an hour. It's 15 minutes before the polls close, and then they find out that even though they're at the polling station that they've always gone to, this election it's not the right one. And then they're being told, oh, you got to go actually to another location in order to vote. And the upshot of that is that they end up disenfranchised. They don't get to cast their ballot. So by making access to transfer certificates a little easier, that means that in situations like that, there'll be a remedy right there where they can vote even though they happen not to be at the right specific polling station. They're still at a polling station in their riding, and they don't lose their vote because they ended up at the wrong place. So that was a way that we could act now on the commitment in the CASA while taking the logistical concerns that the CEO of Elections Canada raised. I think, you know, as New Democrats, we're certainly confident that in time we can get there. We know that some provinces already have the ability to vote anywhere from within a poll. So the technology exists, but that doesn't mean that you can implement it on a timeline for the next election in the context of Elections Canada. So we wanted to be sensitive to those concerns. We wanted to make progress, but do it in a way that's realizable for the next election and mandate Elections Canada to continue that work beyond the next election to try and have it in place for a subsequent election.
The bill talks about clarifying certain offenses such as deep fakes. Can you explain what your bill will do to protect Canadians from this growing trend, Minister LeBlanc?
So I'll offer a quick comment, and maybe Jennifer or Daniel would want to add something. Again, the Elections Act has to evolve with new technologies. And there's a real concern around the world, we've seen it in other jurisdictions, around the potential use of deep fakes, artificial intelligence creating deep fakes that can have a very serious impact on an election. It's certainly something that the security services talk to me about in terms of strengthening our ability to resist foreign interference in the electoral context. Recognizing that this is a complicated space, the idea was to give the Commissioner of Elections, an independent person responsible for the application of the elections law, the ability to look at the context of how a deep fake, for example, was designed to either disrupt an election. The idea is to disrupt the electoral process or target a particular candidate. Recognizing again that this we'll want to hear from parliamentarians, we'll want to hear from experts. We think that, and this was certainly subjects of expert advice around making the Elections Act responsive to the threat of new technologies, but in no way would this be in any way designed to limit the free political speech that are important parts of the electoral process. But if a particular foreign state hostile actor were to be creating, for example, a deep fake or using artificial intelligence in a way that was designed to sabotage an electoral process, we think Elections Canada should properly have in the legislation the tools to deal with this.
And prosecuting these offenses could take weeks, months, maybe years. Is there anything in this act that would make Elections Canada more responsive to tackle those real threats such as deepfakes, like in the moment?
And again, you've identified a very real challenge. Elections Canada is credible in terms of administering free and fair elections precisely because it's independent. So to have the government or parliament direct them on the speed to which they should conduct investigations or prosecutions or compliance would obviously be inappropriate. But we'll continue to be governed by the advice of Elections Canada and work with them. They have the responsibility, and they have, we think, a proud track record of making our electoral system free and fair and resistant to interference. But you're right, in the arrival, this is one of the challenges of those technologies. The speed in which they can move, the context of an election necessarily moves quickly. But we think by giving Elections Canada additional tools in this area, it will send a clear message that Parliament wants us to be able to resist in an appropriate legislative way this particular threat. But we have faith that Elections Canada will know how to apply these provisions in their independent and appropriate judgment.
On that, what is the enforcement there? Somebody puts out in the middle of an election a deep fake of the Prime Minister or whoever. What powers does Elections Canada or any other authority have to take that down or to take action under this bill?
So again, by creating the offence per se and by giving Elections Canada additional authorities, they, in their independent judgment, know how to enforce the Elections Act. So this is an evolving space. The threat of disinformation is also a huge challenge. I, as the public safety minister, receive updates from our security agencies around these threats. So we think that it's important for Elections Canada to benefit from authorities that recognize this technology. But again, we have faith that Elections Canada, in terms of how they apply the election legislation, will be in a position to make those judgments independently. Merci beaucoup. Thank you.
Banning false and misleading statements. Who determines what's false and misleading? How does the Act determine that?